Tim, and welcome to the sixth installment of our Laurel Canyon's Legends Walk. And today we're going to devote the entire episode to somebody that was synonymous with Laurel Canyon. So we're going to visit some of his Laurel Canyon haunts and homes, some very obscure, some totally, absolutely iconic. And of course we're talking about Frank Zappa. He was a guy that was a world-class musician, composer, sometimes political activist, and he also had a really great but bizarre sense of humor, as we'll get into a little bit later. But before we delve into some of the haunts here in Laurel Canyon, we're going to drive about 5 or 6 miles east down Sunset Boulevard to Echo Park. So here we go. So here we are at the little 2-bedroom bungalow here in the Echo Park section of Los Angeles. We're on Bellevue Avenue. And this is where Frank Zappa lived after he moved from his beloved Z Studios in Rancho Cucamonga, which is about 50 miles east of here, not far from San Bernardino. Now, while here, Frank got a job and was working downtown in LA at Wallach's Music City, as it's a record store. And it suited him well because Zappa was a major record collector, and he stored his record collection in the bathtub in his apartment right here. This is where Frank conceptualized the Mothers of Invention, and where he wrote many of the songs for their debut album, Freak Out, which, by the way, was one of the first double albums ever made. It was produced by Tom Wilson. You've probably heard me talk about it before. He produced Like a Rolling Stone for Dylan and The Sound of Silence for Simon Garfunkel. He was nothing if not eclectic. But here's where we are. I think it's interesting to note that although Frank was at the epicenter of the flower child movement, he never considered himself a hippie. He did consider himself a freak, but he never did drugs. He never did anything stronger than there was a constant deluge of coffee and cigarettes in his life, but he never altered his mind with drugs. Apparently he didn't need to. So here we are back in Laurel Canyon. We're on Kirkwood. Maybe 2 or 3 blocks up from the country store. And in 1966, the Mothers of Invention were in full swing, and Zappa was living in this small bungalow with a couple of friends, one of whom was Pamela Zerbica. She worked as a secretary for Elmer Valentine, who was the owner over at the Whiskey A Go-Go. So as the story goes, Pam had to pick Frank up at the airport one night, and she brought along her coworker, Gail. And when they met at the airport, it was love at first sight. And they soon moved into this bungalow together, and it became the epicenter of the burgeoning LA rock scene at the time. It was not uncommon to meet the Doors here, the Animals, Buffalo Springfield. It was quite the gathering spot at the time in Los Angeles. So here we are a couple blocks farther up Kirkwood on Briar. And to this house right here, it's a very obscure house, but I think it's worth noting. This is where Zappa in '67 wrote his first solo album without the Mothers of Invention, his orchestral record, Lumpy Gravy. It's interesting to note that although Frank wrote Lumpy Gravy, due to contractual obligations, he was not allowed to play on his own record. But the contract didn't say anything about him not conducting the record, so that's what he did. He was the conductor. As a matter of fact, one of the guys in the wrecking crew named of Tommy Tedesco ended up playing Zappa's guitar parts. Now, a lot of these orchestral sidemen, union sidemen, they were a bit reticent at first because they knew who Zappa was. He wasn't really known for orchestra. But they later became advocates of his work. They liked it that much. They were impressed with it. Lumpy Gravy ended up being one of Zappa's personal favorite records. So, right here. All right. So we're on the corner of Laurel Canyon and Lookout Mountain. And this would be the equivalent of being on Main Street and First anywhere else in the United States. But this is the site of the most infamous Frank Zappa home, the Log Cabin. Originally, this place was built in 1915, and it was the site of the Laurel Tavern, then the Log Cabin. It was also once owned by Western silent actor Tom Mix. And some of the visitors in this place that Tom Mix had, as legend has it, was Wyatt Earp, who was one of his best friends, believe it or not, a real Western hero. The Log Cabin here, which was in this area right here, it had a living room that was 75 by 35, and it had a basement with a one-lane bowling alley, and it was the perfect place for a band. Frank and his now wife, Gail, moved here in the spring of 1968 with their growing family, and they paid the ungodly amount of $700 a month in rent. Originally, there were about a dozen people living here, between band members, family, nannies, etc., but it soon became the biggest party house in LA, and it wasn't uncommon to have to walk over just a sea of people to get from one end of the room to the other. If you were a musician or a pop culture person in LA living in these times, it was considered de rigueur to come at the Zappa house. It had that kind of hubris to it. I think it's also important to add that although his shows were a mixture of music and comedy and even social commentary, contrary to urban legend, Frank never took a dump on stage nor ate a dump on stage, although he did say that the closest he came to it was at a Holiday Inn Express in 1973 at their buffet line. But okay, here we are. So here we are on Woodrow Wilson Drive, and this was the residence that Frank and Gail and their 4 kids lived in. As you can see, it's a bit more country roads than Main Street. But in 1968, Gail and Frank bought this place for the astounding sum of $78,000. The main selling point of this place is that it has a large basement underneath it, which is kind of rare here in California. And it could accommodate Frank's recording studio, which I believe was called the Utility Muffin Research Kitchen. And don't ask me why, but I have no clue. Maybe you do. It wasn't uncommon for Frank to work 12-hour days, 7 days a week, and it's said that his family had to pry him away from his studios even for things like Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas dinner. Frank and Gail lived here until Frank passed away in 1993 and until her death in 2015. So, there's a story that I think sums up Frank Zappa as good as any. When he was a young teenager, Zappa's favorite artist was a very avant-garde composer named Edgar Varese. And Varese did stuff like he'd have 12 drummers, a piano, and a guy playing a siren. And it was, to put it nicely, somewhat hard to listen to. But anyone that would come to the household, he would force to sit down and listen to a piece of this guy's music as what he called it, an intelligence test. Anyways, for Zappa's 15th birthday, his mother asked him what he wanted, and Frank requested a long-distance phone call to Varese. In those days, you could look up somebody's, even a famous person's number in the phone book and get it, and a long-distance phone call was a bigger deal than it is now. So Frank called. He didn't get a hold of Varese, but he did talk to his wife, and a few weeks later he got a correspondence letter from Varese thanking him. And Frank had that letter hanging in his studio, various studios, for the rest of his days. Say whatever you want about Zappa, but he definitely lived to the beat of his own drummer, and sometimes 12. With that, I'd like to thank you for hanging out with us. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done it. And from Laurel Canyon, this has been my pleasure to bring this to you.